Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, entire neighborhoods destroyed. No electricity, fuel, food or water. Israel imposes a total blockade on Gaza's more than 2.3 million Palestinians. Also this week, as the world economy faces new uncertainty from the Gaza war, we take a look at what it could mean for Israel's economy. And for the first time in 50 years, the IMF and World Bank hold their annual meetings on the African continent, discussing economic growth, climate change, debt and inequality. Israel's declaration of war on Gaza following a surprise military offensive by Hamas has jolted global financial markets. Oil prices surged before falling again to $70 a barrel as fears of a wider regional conflict took hold. Goldman Sachs forecasts that Brent crude could climb to $100 a barrel by June if the conflict drags on. A higher oil price would further complicate efforts to contain inflation in a fragile global economy. But what is the initial cost of the war on the Gaza Strip and on Israel? Let's take a look first at the grim humanitarian and economic situation in Gaza. The Gaza Strip has been under an Israeli air, land and sea blockade since 2007. It is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. More than 2.3 million Palestinians live in an area of around 365 square kilometers. The United Nations says the unemployment rate in Gaza is one of the highest in the world. 70% of young graduates don't have jobs, and nearly half the population is out of work. 64% of households are classified as food insecure and depend on humanitarian aid. The situation in Gaza before the war was already dire. It's now expected to get even worse. Its 2.3 million residents already face shortages of water, food and fuel on a daily basis. 40% of the water supply is lost on the way to consumers due to the crumbling infrastructure system. More than 112,000 families are without their regular food supplies because of the Israeli airstrikes and the forced closure of UN Relief and Work Agency food distribution centres. Electricity and fuel shortages are crippling farming and fishing, meaning there's even less food. And the only local electricity producer has shut down after running out of fuel. Well, Israel's current military operation against Gaza is not the first. Between 2008 and 2021, Israel launched 4 major offensives in the besieged enclave. But this conflict, Palestinians say, is different. In the first 5 days of Israel's bombardment, at least 330,000 people fled their homes, a number that is likely to rise. Gaza is going to need billions of dollars for the reconstruction of homes, businesses, water and electricity infrastructure, as well as the hospitals that have been damaged or destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. Now, back in 2021, the Israeli military offensive destroyed 1,500 housing units and cost the Gaza economy more than $479 million. From 2006 to 2022, Gaza's agricultural sector lost about $1.3 billion as a result of Israel's blockade and multiple attacks. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by Bassem Khoury from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. He's a former Palestinian economy minister and currently the CEO of the Farmer Care Group. Thank you so much for your time, sir. So Israel has now imposed a complete siege on Gaza. That includes the ban of food, electricity and fuel entering the Strip. Give us a sense of what impact that is likely to have on the people and the families that live in Gaza.
What we're seeing in Gaza today, simply put, and this has happened over the past 6 days, are simply war crimes. And the situation is really dire. I am in constant contact with our staff there. We have 22 employees there. 2 of them have lost their homes. One of them has just small damages, but you're speaking about whole neighborhoods being wiped out. It is happening, is unprecedented, and needs to be stopped.
Gaza's sole power station has now run out of fuel. Without fuel, how does a population survive?
Well, I would like to emphasize the fact that even before this latest war, Gaza has been suffering from huge power shortages, maximum 4 hours. So people in Gaza have depend on their generators, but private generators that they can get at least 3-4 hours of electricity a day. Now, what is happening is that also these private generators have either been blown up by the explosions, by the bombardment, or have run out of fuel. So we've been in contact with the main hospital in Gaza, Al-Shifa Hospital, and they're telling us that they're also having severe problems there.
Tell us a bit more about the medical situation there, because the hospitals rely on aid coming in, and that is not happening now.
That's true. Unfortunately, aid is not coming through, and the medical situation is definitely very dire. Gaza has only 2 small factories for manufacturing pharmaceuticals. I was in contact with the 2 factories, and of course, none of them are working. One of them was severely damaged. So the situation for medicines is becoming also dire. Unless we can push for a humanitarian relief to start entering into Gaza, definitely there will be lots of huge catastrophes for the people there due to the lack of medication.
300,000 people in total so far, I believe, have been displaced from their homes. Where are these people going? Because they're obviously not allowed out of Gaza.
What we're seeing is that schools, public buildings, of course, not government buildings, but other buildings, UNRWA buildings, are becoming the only refuge for people there. And the bombardment this time started and is concentrated on the Rimal neighborhood. For those of you who don't know Gaza, Rimal neighborhood is what you can describe a little bit more an upscale neighborhood in Gaza. It is not a refugee camp. Inhabitants there are middle class or high middle class, and some of the buildings there are all multi-story buildings. And you're seeing the hit to the hardcore of the Gaza community, the hardcore of the Gaza society. So where do people go? This is a very good question. I was in contact with a doctor friend of ours. He has dual citizen. He has a Greek citizenship. Through the embassy, they evacuated him to go to Rafah checkpoint, to go to Egypt. And before they reached Rafah with like 1 or 2 kilometers, Israel bombarded the checkpoint, the border crossing. So basically, I called him back. He said, "We're now back in Gaza. Our neighborhood is almost completely devastated, and definitely we don't know where to go."
Mr. Khoury, many Gazans were earning a living by working in Israel. We're hearing now reports many of these jobs have now been terminated. What impact is that going to have on the economy in Gaza?
As a result of the labor shortage in Israel, Israel allowed around 15,000 laborers to work in Israel. These became the most influential, most important source of income for Gazans. However, it could hardly make a dent in the catastrophe of the economy of Gaza, especially with the situation over there that has been pushing for the last decades. But still, it became a very important source of income. It's important to point out that before the last war, as per an EU official, 70% of people of Gaza depended on food aid from different places. It's the situation, unfortunately, with these laborers is very bad. We are now getting many of those laborers into Palestinian territory in West Bank, different cities. So it's also another human catastrophe that is coming here. You're speaking about thousands of people that are left with nothing in the West Bank, and their families are on the receiving end of bombardment in Gaza. So it's the situation for them is very bad.
Thank you so much for your time. Bassem Khoury from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, former Palestinian economy minister.
Thank you.
Israeli stocks and bonds fell after Hamas launched its military operation, and many businesses and schools have remained closed. American airlines and some European carriers have suspended flights to Israel, while governments have urged airlines to be careful when flying in Israeli airspace. An analysis by Radar Box, which specializes in navigational data, shows that about 30% of flights to Israel were cancelled in 3 days. 1,000 of the 3,000 flights scheduled between Saturday, October the 7th, when the war began, and Wednesday the 10th were grounded. On the other hand, the central bank announced it was selling up to $30 billion in foreign reserves to shore up the national currency, the shekel. The Israeli currency has already lost roughly 9% of its value compared to the US dollar so far this year and has now fallen to a 7-year low. Joining us from London now is Iran Yashiv, a member of the Centre for Macroeconomics at the London School of Economics. He is also an economics professor at the Eitan Bergler School of Economics at Tel Aviv University. Thank you so much for your time. 300,000 ordinary Israelis have been taken out of the workforce to fight in this war. Presumably that will have an impact on Israel's economy.
Before we discuss economic costs, let me point out the obvious. The real big cost, or the human cost, in Israel, children, women, and men have been killed, have been kidnapped, have been wounded. Gaza is being bombarded and people are killed there. There is terrible human suffering, and this exceeds by far any economic cost that we're going to talk about. As to your question, yes, it can be something in the order of almost 10% of the workforce that could be mobilized to the war rather than doing normal work.
And tell us a bit about these reservists. What are their jobs? So if they are not doing those jobs, what sort of impact are we talking about?
They come from all over the economy. It's not restricted to one particular sector. And the economic cost for Israel in this context is twofold. On the one hand, you lose the output produced by these people in the various industries. On the other hand, you have to finance their mobilization into the war effort, which is obviously costly. It's not that they just fight or do any duty. They use military capital. They need to be paid by the government and so on. So it's you lose output and you create expenses.
We've seen the currency, the shekel, take a bit of a hit. It's fallen to a 7-year low over the last few days. What is your outlook for the currency?
Basically, I'm pessimistic about the currency, although with currency markets, it's very dangerous to forecast the short term. Even the long term is pretty difficult. The shekel has been depreciating since the beginning of the year because of the very substantial negative political developments within Israel. So it went from around 3.5, roughly, a bit less, at the end of 2022 to over 380 recently before the war. And now it has shot up to the region of 395, going on to 4. I believe it will touch 4 shekels to the dollar at some point. So it's a combination of factors, pre-war and war. I don't see the shekel strengthening by very much. The possibility of that is remote at this stage. I, though, think that the uncertainty is how far will the depreciation go? Will the shekel depreciate substantially more or much less so? But I don't see a real possibility soon of an appreciation of the shekel.
Right, and presumably the same sort of reasoning will impact investor sentiment as well.
Exactly. Investment has been falling pre-war because of the grave political developments, especially investments in the high-tech sector. And investment will surely fall now, or continue to fall, or the fall will be worse. But obviously that depends a lot on the severity and the duration of the war, which at this moment is very unclear.
We talked about the cost of the war on Israel. The US has just announced an additional $8 billion in aid to Israel. But obviously, with the ongoing war in Ukraine, now this war, how long, realistically, do you think the United States and others will continue to provide that sort of financial assistance to Israel?
Well, in normal times and in recent decades, Israel has not really needed at all any American assistance. And the assistance that was there was mostly for military purchases, and a big chunk of it was actually on American exporting firms, so it benefited the US as well. Israel is no longer this poor economy reliant on the US. And in fact, Israel in normal times can stop US assistance altogether, and I would actually advise the Israeli government to do so. The current situation may be helped by US assistance, but I view it more as a political gesture and a signal of support rather than any major US economic aid. Again, Israel is not in the situation of a few decades ago where it actually really needs American assistance. That said, there is a point about ammunition and armaments that where Israel is in need of US assistance, and that again depends on the duration and the severity of the war. For example, if the war extends to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, to conflict with Iran, and so on.
Many thanks for your time. Eran Yashiv, economics professor at the Eitan Berglas School of Economics at Tel Aviv University. Thank you.
Thank you.
The world's finance ministers and central bank governors have met in Marrakesh, Morocco, to discuss ways to tackle climate change, natural disasters and debt restructuring. At the IMF and World Bank gathering, African nations called for reforms and fair representation. Hashem Ahalbara reports now from Marrakesh.
Kristalina Georgieva is on a charm offensive.
A prosperous 21st century is only possible with prosperous Africa.
Offering greater economic cooperation between rich Western nations and African countries. For the first time in 50 years, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have held their annual gathering on the continent. The two global financial policymakers are facing growing backlash from African nations.
In the north is the capital, with aging populations. If we built a bridge for capital to travel where it would make a difference, Africa would do well, the world would do well.
But African countries want lenders to respect their sovereignty and stop issuing orders. But above all, they want an overhaul of the global financial system.
For years, poor countries have been calling for a reform of the international monetary system, seeking a bigger say in IMF decisions. They also want to end the condition of implementing austerity measures and spending cuts in exchange for loans, a practice they blame for their political and economic woes.
Host Morocco is a long-time borrower. In the aftermath of last month's devastating earthquake, the IMF approved a $1.3 billion loan for its rebuilding and recovery. But loans and credit may not make much difference amid growing challenges.
When we are having the conversation of how much financial resources are available, and we need to choose between food security, debt, climate finance, economic, I would say, investment, we need all of them. And this is our, I would say, pledge together.
The global economy has changed. IMF members have so-called quotas or voting powers based on their economic performance. China's quota is less than Japan's. Beijing wants that to change to reflect its growing economic clout. Global economic outlook for 2024 is grim. Growth in some countries in the Middle East and North Africa has fallen sharply compared to last year. War in Ukraine, food shortages and inflation will slow global economic recovery.
That's why what we're trying to do in the course of this entire process of this annual meeting and seek approval from our governors is to redefine the vision of the bank to be that of eradicating poverty, but on a livable planet. And what we mean by livable planet is exactly these challenges of pandemics and climate change and food insecurity and fragility and those kinds of issues that we refer to.
Slow recovery is bad news for countries struggling to repay debt. Lenders are dishing out spending and borrowers may suffer for years. Argentina is struggling to restructure its $43 billion IMF loan. Egypt's bonds have tumbled following Moody's rating cut. Pakistan, Zambia, Ghana and many others may not be able to repay their creditors. Activists are urging the IMF and World Bank to write off debts, warning that restructuring won't solve the problem. Hashim Al-Barra for Counting the Cost, Marrakesh.
Well, Hashim met with Fareed Balhaj, who is the Vice President of the World Bank for Middle East and North Africa. He began by asking what the World Bank's forecast for the region means for these economies.
As you know, the economies in MENA are divided in two, broadly speaking. One is those countries that are exporting oil and those who are importing oil. The dramatic plummeting, in a way, is coming from those countries in the Gulf, and Algeria and Libya. So the issue is that, oil prices go down and these economies go down. Now, one thing to keep in mind, in the non-oil sector of those economies, there's something interesting happening. Diversification is paying off very much. Look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Almost 4% growth in the non-oil segment of the economy. This is very encouraging. And it gives you a sense that moving ahead on diversification is the way forward. And this is why what's happening in Saudi Arabia, what's happening in the UAE is really to be encouraged. And hopefully other countries in the Gulf, other oil exporting countries will do the same.
Hashim also met Catherine Patillo, the Deputy Director of the IMF's Africa Division. He began by asking her if there was light at the end of the tunnel for the African economies.
After 4 years of crises, including the global pandemic, there are some tentative signs that the outlook for the African continent is improving. Now, the region is very diverse, but we're seeing an expected improvement in growth from 3.2% in 2023 to 3.8% in 2024. Again, the situation is diverse, and we expect, though, that given higher private investment, which is a good sign, private consumption, that we'll see increases in growth in around 3/4 of the economies on the continent.
Petya Coeva-Brooks, Deputy Director at the International Monetary Fund, spoke to Hashim about the International Monetary Fund's global outlook for growth in 2024.
Well, we are having a global economy that on one hand has been quite resilient after many shocks that have hit over the years. So in that sense, I think that is the positive in our assessment, that resilience that we've seen. But then we're also seeing growth this year of 3% and next year of 2.9%. That is relatively slow by historical standards. And we're also seeing growth that is very uneven across regions with a lot of divergences. So I think that's the theme of our report. And speaking of divergences, this also, we see it in the near term too. We have upgraded our forecast for the US. We have downgraded our forecast for the Euro area and China. We have upgraded our forecast for many emerging markets. So we are seeing different developments across the world.
And that's our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Marlene Saeed. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or, of course, you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's lots more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.